All right, we're good. All right, hello everyone, and everyone joining us online. Thank you very much for joining us here at the University of Sydney. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional of custodian and the law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you very much for coming. It is GambleAware Week in New South Wales. So we're really pleased that you're able to join us, and for everyone joining us online as well, of course. So we've got a really interesting lineup today. What we wanted to do was have this professional development event. We're having an event later in the week on Thursday, led by Dr. Christopher Hunt, that is more focused on multicultural gambling. But today we really want to get back to basics and provide an in-depth overview of the theory and practices that we operate on here at the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic. So we're going to start with a presentation by Dr. Fadi Anjoul, a clinical psychologist who's been working with us at the University of Sydney for many years and developed the clinical model on which our treatment is based. So we're going to get an overview of what that looks like, just the real principles underpinning it, which we're hoping will inform each and every one of you in your own practices, something that you can take into whether you're developing interventions and treatments or public policies or operations, so that you're understanding what it is that where the gambling mindset is. After that, we're going to have some morning tea. We're going to have a chance to chat and get to know one another for the people who are here in person. And then I'm going to give an overview of what work we've got underway in terms of research at the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic. And we're also going to hear from my colleague, Dr. Louise Thornton, who works at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Abuse, particularly around the topic of how do we actually engage participation from people who we need to work with, especially in terms of digital interventions. So we're really looking forward to this morning. Please feel free to ask questions. If you're in person, hand up. If you're online, pop your questions into the chat box and they'll come through to us here. And I would like to start by welcoming Dr. Anjoul to give his presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you all for attending this event today, and thank you all for attending online, wherever you are out there. And thank you, Professor Sally Gainsbury, for making all this happen today and inviting me to give a talk on this very important subject to me. Actually quite exciting for me to be. I don't get out very much, and it literally would be almost the very first time I've actually talked about my work in a public forum after 27 years. So it's been a while that I've kind of kept to myself, and it's really exciting that I'm finally out to be able to share in what I've learned over the years in terms of gambling and how to approach it. So just a quick outline. I'm just going to give a little bit of introduction and some background to understanding what I'm calling the gambling mindset and how it can be deconstructed or kind of pulled apart to try and work out where the components are. And once you do that, then what does that tell us in terms of informing what can be done to mitigate gambling? So in terms of the introduction, I think it's worthwhile to talk somewhat briefly about my own background going into gambling. So I start off as a Bachelor of Science student with majoring in biology, and I did my first degree in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada, at a university called Dalhousie. And in doing a Bachelor of Science, we use physics, chemistry, math, and of course biology. And at the time, I had this friend who, Hillary, whose dad was a philosophy professor at the university, and I was kind of caught my interest. What is philosophy? what does it kind of teach? So because he was my friend's father, I started just kind of turning up at his lectures just out of curiosity, just to learn about what philosophy was all about. And it turns out philosophy is really about the plight of the human condition, which is, quite interesting. What makes us, why we do the things we do, what is a life worth living, how do you go about living a good life, and answering some more significant questions like, why do we know things, and how do we know what we know is true, and things along these lines. That comes to bear, I suppose, later on, and that's why I'm. So for the last 27 years, really, I've entertained myself with two particular questions. And it really has been a joy to kind of engage in these two particular questions. Nothing kind of made me happier than kind of sit in my own room and just kind of think about things. And I suppose I've done that far too long, but nonetheless, here are the two questions that I would have been able to bring a multidisciplinary approach to bear on these two particular questions. So bringing ideas from physics, chemistry, biology, and philosophy, including psychology, to help me understand how to answer these two questions. First question is the persistence question. Why does gambling persist despite mounting losses? It's not an easy question to answer. There's all kinds of answers, but what we want is one that informs what can be done. And that's the intervention question. So the intervention question is, how do we reduce the harm that is produced by gambling? And I suppose what I'm trying to show here is, the answer to one will certainly inform the answer to the persistence questions will certainly inform the answer to the intervention question. I also might note that whatever answer we formulate to the persistence question, it's going to be incomplete, because what we're trying to do is model something. And whenever you're trying to model something, it's a necessary simplification of the real thing. Nonetheless, some answers are a bit more consistent with the real world. And this is really important, because your model has to capture the thing that you're trying to model, which is what something is actually happening in the real world. So it's a very important criteria in terms of evaluating the consistency of your model. And more importantly than that, your model has to be useful. If it can't be applied, then what's really the point of it, in terms of if you can't implement it to produce some kind of effect. And I suppose one more point I would like to say, in some ways, every theory or every model of why gambling persists, there's a degree of truth to almost everything. I suppose the difference in the theories is in terms of consistency and usefulness. So when I first saw my very first gambling client, that would have been in 1996. And at that point, I'd actually moved to Australia and commenced a degree in clinical psychology right here at the University of Sydney. And through various serendipitous events, ended up deciding that I wanted to pursue a research interest in gambling, and more so a research interest in treatments for gambling. So as you do at the time, you just kind of consult the literature to see what is available in terms of informing ideas about why gambling persists and what to do about it. And at the time, the name for persistence, despite mounting losses, was pathological gambling. That was the classification in what's called DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which maybe some of you have heard of. And in that classification manual, the disorder called pathological gambling was classified in a category called impulse control. And the general thinking was that persistence despite harm occurs because the individual has impaired control over themselves. And in more practical terms, what that translates into is that there is some sort of faulty braking system within the person that they're not able to apply the brakes to their own behavior. And the reason for that, it was thought was, perhaps it was due to some sort of pathogen or some biophysiological entity or process that hijacked their ability to apply their own brakes. And also around that time, a lot of the thinking around gambling was that it was more or less in the same category as substance abuse, insofar as that they were both addictions, that they both could be explained in terms of some sort of faulty braking system owing to a disease or owing to some kind of pathogen that impaired the ability to self-regulate. And so that was the general thinking. And because gambling was kind of clumped in the general category of addiction, along with substance dependence, almost all the treatment protocols at that time were borrowed more or less from drugs and alcohol. So for me, wanting to do some early research on gambling treatment, it meant that I had to bring over a template, a protocol that was pretty much developed in the area of drug and alcohol, and learn how to adapt that so that it could be applied to gambling. And I were clearly in the early days how terrible I was at that effort. It really didn't go very well for me. And I still have visions of that poor young lady, crying in the middle of our session. The textbook didn't teach me anything about how to respond to that. So it created some angst for me in terms of, what was going wrong, and why didn't I feel like this was actually working or was effective? And I suppose there was, three things that I could have pointed to at the time. Obviously, I was doing something wrong, or the adaptation was something wrong, or perhaps it was something else. And the more I thought about it, the more I leaned away from blaming myself, which was the early reason I thought there was limited success. And I started to notice that there are inconsistencies between gambling, or treating gambling as an addiction, I suppose, much like drug and alcohol. And here are two particular inconsistencies I want to, draw your attention to. First is this idea of, okay, let's compare what happens when you take 10 drinks in a short period of time and place 10 bets in a short period of time. So you start off, you haven't done anything. So a bet or drink equals 0, where the initial state is sober if you're talking about drinking, and the initial state is even if you're talking about gambling. And so here's a sequence of 10 drinks where you take 1 beer, 2 beer, 3 beer, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10. I wanted to come to the end of the sequence where what happens when you drink your 9th beer onto your 10th? Well, obviously, whatever's drunken state you're in on your 9th beer gets exaggerated or increased by the time you drink your 10th beer. Let's place 10 bets now. So you got bet 1, bet 2, bet 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And let's just assume we've lost 9 bets. Here's the thing. On the 10th bet, you can return to being even. But on the 10th drink, you can never return to being sober. So there's a structural difference that I think is really important in terms of differentiating gambling from drinking. And that really caught my attention at the time, insofar as, maybe there's something about gambling that is not so similar, or it's kind of unique in some way that is, makes it its own activity. And maybe we shouldn't be borrowing protocols from other areas. Maybe we can develop protocols just for gambling based on its uniqueness. And I suppose the other inconsistency I wanted to kind of draw attention to was something that I would routinely ask all people is that I was treating in the beginning. A routine question is, what's your biggest win? And back then there was no internet. And so what I mean to say by that is, that they could answer that question implied that they were somewhere, and then they went home with the money. And if they were able to be somewhere, stop gambling, and go home with the money, how was that possible if they had a faulty braking system? Why didn't they just continue? So why is it on some occasions it felt like, you know, they could actually stop? So there was an issue for me in terms of this construct or this explanation of impaired control that supposedly underlied persistence. So basically what I then set out to do is to try and figure out something, a different approach to understanding what it is that I was dealing with. And essentially, the difference was that most of the reasoning about gambling had been reasoning by analogy. So this is analogous to drug and alcohol, which was then reasoned analogously as well, because it's the reasoning at the time was, well, intemperate drinking was analogous to some kind of disease that removed someone's ability to control their behavior. And the other approach to reasoning is reasoning from first principles, which is different to reasoning by analogy. Reasoning from first principles it's quite a difficult exercise insofar as you start from the beginning. You almost completely have to ignore what is available out there. It's kind of hard because, you know, what is out there is always going to be influencing how you're thinking. But, you know, the idea is to try and ignore what's out there and begin at the beginning once again. And, you know, this is something that I learned in philosophy. So I was kind of able to see if I could apply it to try and understand the persistence question and how to inform the intervention question. And basically, it's a problem-solving method that you have to boil down. So you have to try and remove as much excess from the thinking as you possibly can, deconstructing the questions and the problems into their most fundamental components, principles, and truth. And the aim of doing that is to get your basic building blocks that are very secure in terms of that you build from, where you minimize the possibility of making mistaken assumptions or inconsistencies. And once you identify what those basic building blocks of their thinking are, then you reason from the ground back up. For me, it's been a wonderful exercise of applying this, because when you reason back up, it created for me a new perspective on gambling and allowed me to develop customized treatment approach just for gambling. And what I want to share with you today is the net effects of that approach and show you a picture, just a very simple picture that to me represents the answer to the persistence question. Okay, so in terms of what are these kind of basic building blocks, you know, these fundamental truths that you begin with and you reason up from them. Let me talk about just three things, I suppose. There's a little bit more to it than this, but so gambling's a behavior, and so the foundations of any behavior is attention. And you have to devote your attention to doing something. And the issue with attention, where we can kind of define it as our innate ability to a property of the mind to focus on stimuli. And I also want to highlight that there's unsaid things that are typically not kind of mentioned when we talk about attention, and that is it has a dual function while ignoring and filtering out other things that sometimes goes unsaid. And it's in this dual function that I want to really highlight, because it turns out this is quite important for understanding the persistence question. And so what I'm trying to show here is, look, here is this dual function of attention. We call it the spotlight effect. And spotlight, insofar as whatever you focus your attention on, well, that's what's highlighted in your mind. But all the while you're focusing attention on something, you're not focused on something else. Something else is hiding from view. And the easy way to understand that is if I'm facing north, well, I guess my attention is focused on what is north, but I don't see what is south. You know, the moment I turn around to see what is south, I'm caught in this trade-off where I can no longer see what is north. So anytime you're focusing attention, two things are happening. You're highlighting and you're hiding. And the question is, sometimes the answers are what we're hiding, not so much what we're highlighting, what is out of view. The other thing about all behavior and gambling behavior as well is, there's decision making. So we decide to go off and do the things that we do, and not just in terms of doing things that we do, but we make decisions, when we're reasoning and we're trying to solve problems in all kinds of areas in our lives. And here's the thing with decision making, it's based on the available informational frame of reference, what we're taking into consideration. And that informational frame of reference is always going to be incomplete. It's always going to be imperfect. And it's always going to be, to some extent, inaccurate. And this is what I'm trying to kind of depict here, is all decision-making has to be within a frame of reference. And it turns out that frame of reference for decision-making, functions much the same as the spotlight effect. It includes and excludes. So it's what you're taking into consideration and what you're not taking into consideration that ultimately affects decision making. And if it's not based on some sort of informational frame of reference, then decision making is based on simpler processes, intuition, biases, emotions, preferences. And I've got a star highlighted next to preferences because it turns out that's a very important consideration when understanding persistence question. And here's one more sort of first principle of behavior. And, again, it's back to philosophy. So philosophy, what is a good life? What is a life worth living? And that's basically the quest of all of our lives, trying to work out how we're going to live a life that is worth living. And insofar as that is a general principle that underpins all kinds of human behavior, gambling included, manifestation of that principle can be expressed whenever we begin any kind of activity. So we know all activities, must have a beginning and must have an end, including gambling. And here's the thing, and so far as we're driven by this first principle of, wanting good things for ourselves, we enter into activities, we do things aiming for positive outcomes, certainly not for regret. We don't go to the beach aiming to drown. That's not the purpose of going to the beach. And no one goes to the casino aiming to do the walk of shame to their car park afterwards. That's certainly not what's happening with gambling. So, here we go. Okay, so some more kind of, basic ideas for how you approach the persistence question. So suppose, someone has been, gambling for 5 years, whatever that might mean. Now, the question here is, okay, how do we approach modeling gambling for 5 years? What would that look like in terms of how, gambling across 5 years actually manifests in the real world? And it certainly wouldn't mean that, they've been gambling continuously for 1,461 days or 35,064 hours, which is the equivalent to 5 years. So the very first thing that I want to draw your attention to is gambling occurs in stops and starts. It occurs in quantums of activity that are spaced apart and whatnot. So if we want to at least visualize what gambling across 5 years would look like, it would more or less look something like this, where this block is a chunk of gambling, and that is the first time gambling. And then we have a line break, and here's the last 4 sessions of gambling. So this is the 260 sessions of gambling, insofar as if we want to assume that across those 5 years, that person gambles, say, once a week for 2 hours per week, that amounts to 260 sessions and 520 hours gambling. Now, here the issue is, what was the person What was it like for that person? What was the phenomenological experience for that person? Was it constant? Was it the exact same across 520 hours, 260 sessions? And this is a very important principle for me in terms of modeling the persistence question or defining an answer to the persistence question. Is you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the person. It's really easy to model from a third person objective. You're kind of just acting as the observer, but that turns out that, that is fraught with some problems. It creates, assumptions and inconsistencies that are unnecessary. So a first principles approach to modeling the answer to the persistent question must begin, for me, at least with modeling point of view, the first person participatory point of view of the person who's doing gambling. So you really try and get yourself into their shoes. And if, insofar as I'm trying to model, 5 years of gambling for this particular person, my model needs to capture states and transitions that matter, because it's not the same experience for that person across 5 years of gambling. There are things that change across time. And so for me, it's been really important to try and determine what are the states and transitions that matter for trying to work out what is going on with this person who's been gambling for 5 years. And here are some important considerations. At some point, they were not gambling. At one point, there was a first-time gambling, and then they started to gambling at fairly low rates. So there's a kind of a minor turning point, and that's the general pathway, or the general progression that you see with everyone who has ever come in to see me for gambling treatment. Is there was no gambling, a first time gambling, a period of low gambling. Then there's a period where there was an uptick, so gambling started to increase. So for me, well, what's the minor turning point? How do we explain this preliminary uptick as well as the second one? So where's the major turning point? And insofar as I'm trying to model the first person, I want to understand what's going on with them in real time, in the real world. Here's how I approach, modeling 5 years of gambling. I really want to model just these 4 points. I want to model what it's like for them before the start of a gambling session, during a gambling session, afterwards, and in between. Because if I've got that one point, if I've got that one particular model where I have these 4 major transition points, then I've got the 5 years, because it's just a repetition of that. So it's just that times 260 more or less. Okay. I want to now begin this deconstruction, this kind of unraveling of the gambling mindset. I want to kind of introduce 2 concepts: root cause and enablers. So to get to root cause, the first thing that I do is, or at least in my own mind, is I need to untangle all the possible layers of explanation, or causal layers of explanation. And so for me, I see gambling as a complex behavior. There's this whole area called complexity science that I'm really interested in. And what that means is there is no single cause. There's no single answer to the persistence question. It's a complex answer. So what that means is the cause is more or less a composition of many factors. And for me, it has been a really important exercise to try and separate what I call, the general causes from the specific cause, to begin to approach what I think is a more accurate understanding of the persistence question. And for me, there are general causes of everything that we do, just whatever it is that we do. And that general cause is life. Life in general is actually quite challenging. And that, the fact that life is challenging, that comes out, and that kind of influences lots of things that we do, including, I suppose, gambling. And so when I say, life in general is challenging, it's boredom, monotony, work, relationships, finance, events, stress, disappointment, frustration, etc. But none of those specifically cause gambling. If I'm bored, there's options that I have. Why gamble? Well, I picked gambling amongst all the possibilities that I could use to alleviate my boredom. And that's what I'm trying to represent here, insofar as I want to model an answer at A1. So answer to the first question, the persistence question. There's lots of layers of causes and lots of particular things I can look at. The question, how do you kind of weave through all that to try and get to root cause? And so for me, there are general causes and there are gambling specific causes. And this then, for me, translates in having to subdivide the first question, why does gambling persist despite mounting losses, to highlight gambling. And so now, here's the way I, began to understand, why gambling. And I, started referring to something called the specificity question. To my mind, what is specific about gambling? There's what makes gambling unique. And it's what makes gambling unique that helped me to understand, why you keep gambling. Insofar as in some part it's influenced by, general life issues, but the specificity of what makes gambling unique helped me to understand why you pick gambling, to alleviate boredom and not any other activity. And here's one of the key pictures that I use to understand specificity question. And this is a model of a single gamble, so one bet. And what is gambling across 5 years other than this placing one bet many times? So here's the building block. Here's the single unit of gambling that then gets repeated over time. And let me show you what's special about this figure. It can be understood as a composition of 3 parts. It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, and it's got an end. And every bet begins with a bet. Every bet begins with a loss. Every bet begins with a cost. And the solid line represents a necessary middle. And the necessary middle is you have to wait. So there's a time 1 and there's a time 0 and a time 1. You have to wait for a short period. So most bets, could be waiting for seconds, could be waiting for minutes. I suppose some bets, waiting for 80 minutes or hours or maybe even years. But on the whole, you wait for a short period. And what are you waiting for? Well, you're waiting for the hashed line to manifest. And what the hashed line represents is an element of uncertainty about what's going to happen after you place the bet. And that's what the hash line represents, the element of uncertainty. And the element of uncertainty can be partitioned into 2 categories. So there's 2 possible outcomes for the bet. You either win something or you don't. And that, to me, is the structure of a single gamble, that it offers the possibility of finding out what's going to happen to your bet in a short period of time. And there's 2 possible outcomes. That's what's unique. No other activity offers that particular structure. And that's what makes gambling, I suppose, gambling. And insofar as taking a first principles approach, we're trying to boil down things as much as you can. What I want to try and do in terms of my answer to the persistence question is boil down to controllable causal psychological mechanisms that matter. So I want to try and explain the persistence question in terms of psychological variables. Why? Because if I can get it down to psychological variables that matter, then that's what I can work with my client. I want to show them, okay, here are some psychological mechanisms underlying the persistence. And once I am able to do that, then I can say, okay, here's how we can start moving these, psychological causes around. And I want to try and focus on the most consistent cause of persistence. In other words, of all possible things that can contribute to persistence, what's the one thing that's always present? What's the one thing that's 100% present across 5 years of gambling? So it's not boredom, for example. That boredom may have some kind of consistency, but the way I illustrate this is, sometimes you're having a great time. You're out with your friends and, it's all fun and you still gamble. There was no boredom, but there was still gambling. And that's what I mean by I want to find that's 100% consistent, that I can identify that helps me to understand every single bet, every single gambling session. That's what I mean by root cause. And root cause, what always happens in mind, I'm trying looking for that psychological mechanism beforehand. So before acting on the thought. So in order to gamble, first of all, gambling has to be on your mind. You don't gamble unless gambling is on your mind. So gambling has to pop into mind. And after gambling pops into mind, the next important moment is you must experience a level of attraction to the thought of gambling. And that to me is where all the action is. What is creating attraction to the thought of gambling beforehand? And in every gambling session, there is a moment beforehand that the person was not thinking about gambling, that started thinking about gambling and experienced some attraction to the idea of gambling and then acted on the thought of gambling. And so before acting on the thought of gambling, there's always attraction to the idea, aiming for a positive outcome. You're not aiming to walk out to do the walk of shame to the car park, as I like to put it. And that's the root cause. So attraction to the idea, aiming for a positive outcome. And here's how I'm representing what that root cause looks like. So I use the structure of a gamble where I've altered it slightly, where now instead of a hashed line pointing towards the positive outcome, or be up or be satisfied, I've got a solid thick line. And that to me is how I capture the concept of attraction to aiming for a positive outcome, where I use a thick line to represent that particular concept. And that's the root cause. Before every episode of gambling, for every bet you have is attraction to the idea before you actually act on it. And now the question is, what allows for that attraction to persist despite gambling losses? And that's where the enablers must come in. So here's the enablers, as far as I can tell, trying to get them down to something that we can talk about in 45 minutes. So the enablers for me is the fundamental. There's just players don't have the required information to make fully informed decisions. They lack knowledge and understanding that limits appeal and attraction to the game. And there's two areas where the knowledge is lacking. The first area is technical domain knowledge of gambling. Gambling exists because of math. There's commercial gambling in society because of math, full stop. That was a technological advancement that occurred somewhere in the 1600s that laid the foundation for modern day gambling. And there's two particular innovations in math that laid the foundation for modern day gambling. The first is, how do you model probabilities? That gave human beings a huge insight. It's been a world changing, where we're able to kind of peer into the future. And how you model probabilities for how things will occur. Yeah, this is how you kind of do it for a horse race, for example. And who the hell knows what the hell this means? So it's really difficult to understand the underlying basis of what makes gambling exist. And most importantly, not just modeling probabilities, but here's a very critical point that most people, or at least not a single person in 27 years that I've come across, has been able to actually articulate, which is, although most people might have some indication that there's a house edge, how is it actually derived? This is something that most people can articulate and don't have a full understanding or appreciation of. And it's hard to actually understand how the house edge is actually derived. Here's how it's derived for anyone who can make sense of what the hell this means. But more intuitively, the house edge is something called the mathematical expectation of the game, or the mathematical value of the game, or the expected value of the game. That's what EV represents. And here's a fundamental fact about all gambling. The EV for the game is positive for the operator, negative for the player. That's a first principle. It's a basic truth to understand about gambling. The second area that there is lack of understanding is what I guess I'm calling inner psychology intelligence. We don't have full insight into what makes us tick as human beings. That's why philosophy was such an interesting exploration for me. We don't know when we're making mistakes. We don't know when our assumptions are faulty. We don't know when our models of the world are actually not so accurate. We just assume that they are. And in addition to just not knowing when we're making faulty assumptions or holding on to faulty beliefs, we're not aware of how we come across how we come to making decisions. A lot of the times there are subconscious processes or heuristical processes, and then to explain that, I usually use the example of if I was to shine a light into your eye, well, your pupils would dilate, but you would have no awareness of the fact that your pupils are dilating or that they are dilating. And so I just want to point out, there are things happening within us that we don't have attention to, and it is also an important part of answering the persistence question is what are the subconscious processes the player doesn't have or isn't kind of paying attention to. And the most important of all of those is the decisional frame, the frame of reference for that allows for the attraction to persist across time. And that's what I want to focus on today in terms of zeroing in on an aspect of the attraction to gambling that I think is really important in helping us to understand the persistence question. And so, let me see, how am I doing for time? Am I good? How much? 50? 50? Oh, okay, plenty. So, to me, here's the term that I use with my own clients. This is how I try and kind of work my way to. This is misinformed attraction. So the persistence to me is a function of misinformed attraction. That's kind of my own way of thinking about why persistence exists. If I want to kind of bring it down to a name, not so much pathological gambling, but to me, this is the more accurate descriptive term. So let me talk to you about this subconscious decisional frame of reference that allows for the persistence of attraction to the idea and acting on the idea of gambling. And how come it's so subconscious? Well, it's just because when we do it so often, we're not even aware of we're doing it. And the irony for me in all of this is, all the while we've been searching for a pathogen, some sort of abnormality underlying persistence. It turns out that the extraordinarily normal way the mind works was a big part of how I came to understand what the problem is. There was no pathogen or abnormality. A large part of it is just the ordinary way the mind works. And here's what I'm trying to represent in terms of how the ordinary way the mind works. All the while we work in our mind, the default frame of reference is what I would call small picture. Our thoughts don't extend very far, much further than the end of the day. So the day is kind of how we kind of structure all our thinking. It's not to say that we can't think past today and we can't kind of think into the past to make decisionals or use past information or potential future information to make decisions. It's just that we're not used to doing that. So the normal way we think is in terms of a today decisional frame. And I want to kind of represent where the problem is for that. And so here's kind of a representation of, okay, here's what's happened over the last 24 hours. I was awake, I slept, and kind of woke back up. And here's this in the moment, this little green flag, and that's the moment where decisions are being made to actually gamble. That's 24 hours. I can squeeze that 24 hours into a month, and then it looks like this. Then I can squeeze the month with the 24 hours into a year. And now this 24 hours looks like a little slither. And when we are making decisions in the moment, we are making decisions as if we're looking through a peephole. We're just kind of looking at what's available now. We're not taking into consideration what has happened up until today. And that, I think, is a large part of explaining why gambling persists. And here's my representation of what that looks like. So here's this person who has gone from not thinking about to thinking about gambling, and they're now experiencing attraction, or they're considering acting on the idea of gambling, and they're using a today decisional frame. What the today decisional frame means is it kind of looks like this. So today nothing has happened. And what's included and what's excluded from this decisional frame? Well, what's included is nothing has happened today. And what's excluded is what has happened up until today. And that is, what I'm trying to represent here. Up until today, this person's been gambling for 5 years. And up until that particular moment, they've lost somewhere in the order of a few $100,000, perhaps, or maybe more or maybe less. And they're not thinking, up until today, I've lost $200,000. Let me go off to gamble. That's an important omission from the decisional frame of reference. So there's this little, uptick here, and it's almost as if they're kind of using a blank slate to think from, what is possible to happen today. And it's a huge part of the problem, as far as I can tell. That gets me to why I call it misinformed attraction, or misinformed consent, or something along these lines. And so here's what I think is going on in the mind of the person in that moment where they're experiencing attraction to the idea and wanting to act on the ideas. In that moment, they're prioritizing the possibility of gain in the context of today. And another way to express that is they're acting on the possibility / illusory subjective preferences instead of reality. They're acting on what they would like to happen today instead of considering all possible information to inform that decision. And acting on their preferences, what they would like to happen today, is represented in this particular image, where now I've got this, focusing on the possibility of a positive outcome, which is natural. And if you're highlighting, then you're hiding. So you're not kind of including information that is less attractive. And you're using a decisional frame that includes and excludes. It excludes what has happened up until today. So it excludes for information that limits the appeal of acting on the idea of gambling. And why this is, so in other words, you're using just your preferences. Gamblers are acting on the preferences, not reality. And what's the reality? Well, the reality is the bigger picture. So they're using small picture, which means they're excluding the bigger picture. And what's the bigger picture? The bigger picture is that, the game is built to have negative value for the player. And that negative value is not just some theoretical thing. That's actually what would manifest for repeated play over time. And that's exactly what is manifested for that player in repeated play over time. And that's excluded from the decisional frame of reference. So the gambling mindset for me, is not just, spotlighting one outcome to the exclusion of the other, but it also is about using the wrong frame of reference, using the wrong size perspective to think about gambling today. That's what enables repeated subconscious pattern that repeated over time, a subconscious pattern of subjective, not objective, subjective attraction to the idea. What can be done? Well, for me, what I do in therapy is I kind of model the gambling. I deconstruct the story of the gambling mindset, its nature, its origins, its history, its roots, its root cause, its progression, its enablers from first-time gambling to a stable pattern of acting on the attraction to the thought of gambling. And I do that across a set of interconnected modules. Modules for me are modeling the major transition points in the moments of change that I think are critical to understanding why gambling persists. So, and they're interconnected insofar as, module 1 sets up module 2 sets up module 3, which is a turning point. Module 3 sets up modules 4, which is some kind of form-specific misunderstanding. And after module 4, we look at some sort of form-specific. And what I mean by form-specific is the misunderstandings for, say, poker machines are not quite the same as those for wagering. Then all that kind of converges back onto here's the today perspective. Here's the today perspective. Here's why you're kind of, acting on information that's not fully informed. That's creating attraction to the idea of going off to gamble. And then that, after done that, I set up what I call module 7, the RID framework, how to fix that up. And that's what I do across, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15 sessions, however long it takes. And here's what else can be done, I suppose, using that particular framework. I want to highlight some failures in harm reduction and prevention scare tactics. That doesn't work, doesn't resonate with unrelatable. You're saying, here's what is the worst possible thing that can happen. It's unrelatable because you haven't told the story of how that works. And once you tell the story of how that works, it's a bit more relatable. You're just saying you're going to go from this point to this point, but there's no details in between. And here's another failure. If you're using the idea that, this is somehow a result of some faulty braking system, it's not. So faulty answers to the persistent question will inevitably inform faulty solutions. Here's a new innovation that I think is really good. So there's better messaging that's coming out, and I think the better messaging, to try to give it a bit more structure, it's focusing on game reality. So we've gone from gambling responsibly to you win some, you lose more. That's game reality. That's consistent with the expected value of the game. And insofar as the decisional frame excludes and includes, some prevention measures going forward might be, assisted loss tracking, where players are kind of given constant summaries, kind of updating them, so it kind of is in their mind where they're kind of up to. And I suppose one other thing I might include is to perhaps, it's time to consider something like a safe gambling benchmark. And this was something that I actually done as part of my own PhD research, trying to determine at what levels do harms emerge. And for me, harm is a relative thing. So Michael Jordan can lose $50 million gambling, but that's no harm to him relative to his personal wealth. And that's what I mean by this, gambling benchmark is relative to your personal resources. What would constitute a safe level of gambling? And for what it's worth, for me, it was something like 5% of disposable income or 5% of net income, if you're going to use that as a benchmark for determining whether or not this is going to get you in trouble or not. And I think that might be useful as something that we can kind of disseminate in society. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Fadi. That was thanks very much, Fadi. That was a fascinating insight, and particularly impressive that was essentially boiled down the key points from 2 days worth of a training that we provide for all our clinicians. So a really useful overview. Oh, good. Okay. Any questions for Dr. Anjoul? Yeah, we've got an online audience, so thank you for speaking into the mic.
You talked about an approach that you use with your clients. And from what I could see, it's more like an educative approach of, showing them actually what happens. How successful is that approach?
I've been using it for 27 years, pretty comfortably. So, for me, the success is reflected in what the real world metrics are. And the real world metrics are, is this clinic, this university likes to use that particular approach. I've certainly liked to use that particular approach. And as far as why we like to use it, because, for us, it feels like it's pretty successful.
Thanks.
If you were going to implement some interventions in a gambling setting, what do you think some of the most effective ones would be? So another way of asking that question is, regulators sometimes use different, interventions that might not be effective. So what do you think would be most effective in a venue, for example?
So I was asked this question many years ago, and I put together a whole detailed proposal, what I think should happen, which got refused. But in a venue, I would dedicate a particular area that explains exactly how the products work, and trying to reduce difficult to understand concepts. And that's the issue here. These mathematical concepts that underpin the game are not for everyone to understand. They're not easy to get your head around. And so, part of my work, part of the focus of my work all along has been, how do I simplify difficult to understand concepts, getting them down to some kind of visual that kind of tells the story that's intuitive to grasp. And then that's basically what I would do, is offer some resource to clients that is on venue that they can discover for themselves, I suppose, a bit more of what the game that they're actually playing is all about.
Hi, Fadi. I'm wondering whether in your model where you draw the interval between the opportunity and the outcome of a bet, is it that's that little sort of three-pronged thing that you do? Is it significant, the time interval between the placing the bet and the outcome, in your experience?
Sorry, I missed the last bit.
Is it significant, the time interval between placing the bet and knowing whether it's successful or failing or failure?
The significance is in how much is at stake. So the more at stake, the more significant it becomes, I suppose.
Let me be a little bit more specific. So I'm involved in the regulation of liquor and gaming in New South Wales. And what I'm really asking about is, because people playing poker machines, for example, have an instant outcome pretty much, is that significant relative to somebody, for instance, who buys a lottery ticket and won't find out about it for a week or two?
Possibly, yes, because, in the 27 years that I've been doing this, I don't think I've seen anyone coming in saying I'm buying too many lottery tickets. So yeah, the wait, the longer the wait, I suppose, the less addictive or appealing that form might be. Sure.
Sorry, 1 second.
First question, they're regarding to the M3 and M4 for the missing the turning point from the gambler. This M3 and 4, this M3 and 4 relative to misinformation. What is the measurement we now for the misinformation in the gambling industry? That's my first question.
So what's the turning point, and how do we measure this?
For the misinformation in the gambling industry, and how can we,
okay.
The measurement to fighting?
So yeah, so M3 is kind of meant, this is what I do in module 3. So module 3 was, okay, I explain where the turning point is. And for me, the turning point in that kind of helps me, it's a theoretical thing, obviously. So somewhere along the way, there's been an uptick in the gambling. So I want to try and reconstruct what happened to create that uptick. And so typically for me, what happens to create the uptick is that the individual develops what I kind of refer to as a theory of winning. So this kind of, here's their idea of how I can apply my knowledge of the game in order to kind of be successful at it. So that's kind of the uptick in terms of what that major turning point is. And then insofar as, okay, here's my theory, here's kind of what I need to think about. And that will help me kind of play a bit more successfully. The misunderstanding and it's like, well, here's what you're not thinking about. Here's the things that you're going to miss that don't actually fall in line with the way you're actually thinking about. So here's what's not in view. So there's usually always something, it's either some kind of misunderstanding, how the game produces its outcomes, or a misconception in terms of, what does, the house edge actually mean, and how do I kind of represent that to the client? And that these are things that are kind of missing from their theory of winning.
Yeah, my second question is also related to that one. If we use the mathematical to calculation before, but now I think it's not really working, because if we apply AI in the gambling machine, AI able to collect all information from that person, including finance, emotional, and hobby, everything. And then we can programming the AI how to, if that person lost into a certain point, we can programming for the robot split the data set to 80% win and 24% loss. We can programming in a few seconds, and then the person win, and then we continue playing in that method. In that, now it happened, and then what can we do in that? If they apply AI in the gambling machine.
So, I think AI is a fascinating thing, and I think it will have applications in understanding gambling that we don't know of yet, and I think there'll be good ones to come. At this stage, I don't think I've thought enough about that question to give it its rightful answer.
Hi, so on the question that was asked before about the time delays, have you experimented with slowing down bet speeds? So as in, would that time delay have an effect on a gambler's attraction to persisting?
Unlikely.
No, so like slowing down poker machine bet?
I don't look at whether it's 4 seconds, 5 seconds, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I mean, there's thresholds where things become critical, and I don't think we're going to exceed. I don't think there's much difference between a game that's played at four bets per second compared to, 20 bets per second or something along these lines. The nature of machines is it's okay, here's a new thing, here's a new thing, here's a new thing. And whether that new thing comes up, whatever the interval of seconds is, it's not going to be a minute. You've killed the game if you're going to have to wait a minute between bets. So it's always going to be some seconds, and I don't think that interval is going to make a hell of a lot of difference, to be quite frank.
So similar to that, what about the amount of money?
Yes, that will make a difference.
Yeah. Tell us how that is.
Well, time is a function of the compounding effects of the expected value of the game, and the compounding effects are a function of the bet. And so if the bet is high, so if you allow someone to place $10 every 5 seconds, it's way different to placing 1 cent every 5 seconds. I've gone out and experimented with $5, and if I place 1 cent, 1 bet, 1 line, I could literally sit on a machine for a few hours and not go through $5. So yeah, bet size is a huge factor, not so much the interval.
So could people still enjoy gambling and gambling behaviors if the bets were much cheaper? Like say they could put a 1 cent bet or something like that. Would they still get that feeling of they're enjoying themselves, but they're not losing as much?
This is a good question. Insofar as we can't think about gambling without understanding its fundamental structure. And so the question involves, what makes gambling exciting is the possibility of a big win. But in chasing the possibility of a big win, you cannot exclude that there's also going to be the possibility of a big loss. And so you're thinking just, again, one-sided about a two-sided game. The higher the bets, yes, that comes with more possibility of a bet big to win big, but bet big also results in losing big. So to finish that off, it's if you exclude the possibility of betting big, then you exclude the possibility of losing big.
Any other questions?
Hi, in the casino industry, there's an old saying that there's only 2 people in the casino. There's a first-time winner and a first-time player. When you actually speak to people, do you find that most of them are first-time winners?
Over 99%. That's the first module is around that particular concept. First impressions are lasting, and what I've yet to see in 27 years of working in this particular field is someone who's come in and says, I lost the first 10 times gambling and I persisted.
Ask you a question building on that. Something I'm often asked is, and I appreciate you breaking us down through what we've discussed as the necessary but not sufficient. So really getting into what's really going on that currently drives the specific factors. So can you explain that? So that's taking away sort of the background history and the subjective, the boredom you used as the example. So what are the key differences? And that's building on this, because you just mentioned one of the key differences is that learning experience, an early first win. What else differentiates, or are there any other group or sort of background factor? What makes someone able to play a machine? Because we know many people, arguably most people who gamble don't experience harms. What differentiates someone who develops these, mindsets and continues to persist despite harm from someone who doesn't?
That's a really good question. So, I guess one of the first things is, this first time winner, which means that whoever goes on to develop this chance is a critical component, not kind of what they were born with genetically, but what they actually experienced in their, initial impressions of gambling. But in addition to this, I think there is a very important consideration. And it's back to this idea of what goes into the decisional frame. What am I taking into consideration and what am I not taking into consideration? And then that reflects the background information that you bring to the decisional frame. So for me, having a background in math and calculus and physics, and what I can use that as a way to think about gambling. And what I learned when I was taking university level math was how do you teach probability? You teach gambling games. That's the way to teach probability. And the thing that you will learn unquestionably, if you take a math degree, is the concept of expected value and how you build that into the game, because the mathematician is the person who is actually engineering the game from the ground up. And what we haven't seen in 16,000 people that have been here, but one exception I heard recently, let's just put that aside for a second. We've never seen anyone with an advanced level math degree presenting to the clinic. And I think that's the critical background information. And that, unfortunately, doesn't kind of represent the majority of the population. Less than half of 1% of people have math degrees. And that's why we don't end up seeing people who do, and the majority of which we don't. So I think math understanding is a critical component.
But that surely can't be the reason, because as you say, most people don't have a critical math degree, yet most people don't develop gambling problems. So, what else is going on that someone will experience harm and others will happily play and then walk away?
I think this is where first principles ends. I don't know what the other first principle might be, so we can speculate. And, now we're looking at, okay, what are the background factors to that particular individual, and whatever, maybe belief in luck or spirituality or I don't know, things along these lines. But in terms of what can we speculate that's absolutely solid and 100% consistent, I'm not sure that I've discovered anything beyond those two principles.
Thank you. No, it's fine. Go ahead. Grab you the mic.
Thanks for your talk. It's been wonderful. I have a particular interest in how we can intervene on decision making, and in the past, in the mental health space, looking at the use of decision aid tools to help people, consider holistically their decision making. And I'm just wondering what we've seen in the mental health space around. It's not really one thing that outweighs something else. It's a consideration of weighing up the pros and cons, considering their moral compass and their values. And I'm just wondering if that's a similar thing that you might be seeing. I'm just wondering how we can intervene on that decision making.
Look, this is what makes the question of persistence an open question, one that cannot be definitively answered. And so I guess my view is, there's always things you can add to try and understand the persistence question. But, as you add things, they become less and less useful. And so the question is, okay, what do you kind of focus in on that is kind of gonna have the most likely impact? And you can, focus on, moral decision-making content, think about your family or something along these lines. And I guess for me, in terms of, my effort to try and customize interventions just for gambling. The thing to focus on is the game reality. That is the kind of high end, or kind of perhaps the thing that might produce the greatest effect. That's not to say you can focus on everything else, but it's that the approach that I'm trying to work out is, I'm trying to isolate just one or two things amongst 1,000 possible candidates, and game reality is the thing that I've kind of come to as the answer to that question.
All right, well, thank you again very much, Fadi, for that fantastic presentation. We're going to take a short break. We're going to come back for those online, well, and for the people here, at about 10:30. So we'll take some morning tea. There's restrooms just outside across the hallway. You can leave your things here. We'll just be outside. Anyone online will be back at 10:30, where I'll be running through the more research side of what we've got going on. So thank you very much, and look forward to having a chat.